So I'm going to pivot to President Ilves, and I'm just wondering if you'd like to sort of talk to us about the Estonia's journey over the last 3 or so decades. If you could tell us about the eStonia project and the different elements in it and sort of how it utilized the eStonia initiative to transform the state. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll try to compress it. Let me just say that the overall message I have is that while technology is the enabler, a tremendous enabler of progress, that technology, precisely because of Moore's law, I mean, it's so cheap these days. The technology itself is not the issue. If you want to develop as a technological society, then it really comes down to, I say, 4 basic things. One is political will. You have to be willing to undertake it. This is not an easy thing. Then out of that political will, you have to craft policies of what you want to do. Then, and this is vital, you have to create the legal basis for it. If you don't have the laws that give you the things that you need, not going to happen. And finally, which is often the toughest part because of, I mean, you need to have people who understand tech and law, you have to craft the regulations that will then manage this. Now, how we got to where we were, I have to go back. We have a neighbor to the north, Finland, and we're ethnically and linguistically closely related. Our languages are like Spanish and Portuguese, basically. If you got one, you can get the other fairly quickly. We had very similar development. We were both under the Russian Empire until 1918, 17. In 1938, which was the last year of full year without World War II, when they could measure things like GDP, the GDP per capita of Finland and the GDP per capita of Estonia were identical. So same level of development. Then came World War II. We were occupied by the Soviets, then we were invaded by the Nazis, and then the Soviets came back. And then we had 50 years of basically arrested development. And we became independent in 1991, and the difference in GDP per capita between Finland and Estonia in 1991 was 13 times.
Wow.
13 times. So, I mean, they were way ahead. And they had all of these things, like they had Nokia, which at that time was generating 4% of annual GDP in Finland, and they were very tech-oriented and so forth. So we had some kind of idea in Estonia that maybe technology would be kind of a good idea. Now, when we became independent, we had all kinds of national debates as to which way we would go. Would we become a Hong Kong, or would we become a Singapore, or would we become, well, I mean, there's some parts of the Soviet Union, they're just as communist as they were before, even more so. If you look at Belarus, which still has collective farms and not doing that well either. And my input to this was, I mean, we had this, people were thinking all over, what are we going to do? And my experience was, I learned to program at age 14. It's not a regular part of the curriculum where I grew up. It was simply, I had a math teacher who was doing her PhD in math education, and she did this experiment with about 12 kids. She got a teletype machine, and we had a big fat telephone modem hooked up to a mainframe 50 kilometers away, and this is 1969. So, and we learned the 12 of us learned how to program, and for me, the moment was having to print or form a graph, print a graph of y equals x squared, and I wrote the program, and when it came out, I said, wow, I just made this happen with my programming. So, I mean, the main effect of that was not that I became a computer programmer, though everyone else in my class did, and they're all rich, is that I learned, I mean, I am not afraid of technology. I mean, when I was in college, I learned a different computer language and study program and made a little money on the side to help me buy record albums. And so, and that was always part of my life. But here, back in 1992, 93, we're looking at I mean, the world looks horrible. I mean, we're poor, we're independent, but no one has any money. The average salary, I think, was, I mean, the average annual salary was about $2,000 altogether, and everyone else was very rich. And one day I was, this is a sort of national sort of worry. What are we going to do? Ideas like joining the European Union are far, far in the future, and how are we going to survive? And I remember when, being a geek, I went and bought, at that time you had to buy it. I bought the first web browser invented by, called Mosaic, invented by Mark Andreessen in 1993. It came out back then. You had to buy it. You had to take your floppies, stick it into your computer. You had a web browser. But then I looked at this thing. It was, it's just like all of you use web browsers, right? But I mean, it's Safari or Explorer or whatever you use. But back then, there were only a couple of thousand web pages. But I looked at this and I said, this is where Estonia is on a level playing field with everybody else. We are no worse or no better than anyone else. And even the United States is just where we are. And so from that came the idea that why don't we really focus on doing the tech side of things. And I knew that we had some good computer scientists there. And out of that, and my childhood experience, I made a proposal which was to computerize all the schools and get them online, which of course was met with all kind of opposition, but the government supported this idea. And by 1997, 98, all Estonian schools were online and had computer labs. And more importantly, they were open to the public after hours, which meant that other people had access. Because, ultimately, the goal was to have digital services with people with their computers or devices, but people didn't have any money to buy computers. So what you want to do is you want to make we had computer banks. Some places have whatever, sort of internet cafes, but we had this state and municipal governments would open computer labs. We were largely helped by the banks. The banks realized that it's much better to do things digitally. It's much cheaper to do things digitally. So the banks and a big NGO and the government jointly did a program where we went around the countryside in buses and taught old people living in the countryside how to use computers. Because the banks didn't want to have a brick and mortar bank in every little village, which they did, because that was the sort of pre-digital era. But every little municipality already had sort of access to computers for its people. So instead of going to the bank, you go to the office of the municipal government and go and use your computer. Anyway, that was again a fairly successful move. But in the late 90s, we got serious because up till then it was wild what we were doing, and it was interesting and it was different, but there was no real sort of plan on what to do. And then a lot of us were sort of thinking around, and we kind of boiled it down to a couple of things that you need in order to have a digital society. For us, it was obvious then, but it should be obvious to the world today that unless you have a strong, secure digital identity, nothing will work. There was enough computer crime back then. We already knew that how do you do computer crime? How do you steal things? You go under someone else's name. We know that passwords, the way they're used to this day, are crackable, very easily crackable. Basically, the standard model that we use everywhere, in business especially, you have your email address and a password. That was invented in the late 70s, early 80s, and it was used by a bunch of academics. Basically, 3,000 academics would communicate with each other on something called BitNet. They would communicate with a network of professors. Generally, they tend to be honest, not a problem. But if you take over this from something used by 3,000 professors, and now you have 4.2 billion people on the web, you know that this model does not work. And it shouldn't work. And of course, now computers are so powerful that it's called brute force cracking, but basically any password is crackable. So you need something stronger than that. So this is why we introduced a digital identity, which has, if I get a little technical, raise your hand, but basically it is called two-factor authentication. you need to have two different things saying you are you, and they have to match. And we do this via a chip card. You don't need a chip card. This is old technology. You can do it on a mobile phone. And we do use it on a mobile phone now. But originally, before we didn't have smartphones when we introduced this in 2001. We only had computers. You didn't have iPads. So that was the initial choice. As soon as we got the iPhone or the mobile phone, smartphone came out, we went over to doing this also on that. But anyway, you need a strong identity. And what that requires is some means of authenticating people using two-factor authentication. You need what we have along is end-to-end encryption. So whatever you're doing to verify your identity cannot be cracked in transit between your computer, your phone, and wherever you want to go. The authentication center, everything basically that we do has been a public-private partnership, because the banks are the ones who rely most on this system that we devise, because they prefer, of course, strong digital communications to having people standing in line in banks. I have not been in a bank, I think, for 13 years. And I should say that because it's something I'll talk about in a moment, but I wanted a renewal loan I had, and I was actually on an IADB trip in Paraguay, which is kind of not that far in digitization, but I had called on the phone and said I need this loan. They sent me the contract, and I digitally signed the contract when I was in Asuncion. So that, you can do this worldwide. By the way, going back, once you have a digital identity, there are a couple of things you need to know about the digital identity, and this is where you get into the political will problem. There's a whole field these days, some people even won Nobel Prizes in it, called behavioral economics. Why do people do what they do? Why do people make economic decisions the way they do? Why do governments, why do companies decide to do one thing or another? Well, when we look at digital identities, we know, or today, but we didn't know back then, but basically, if you offer digital identity, 15 to 20% of the population will want it because they think it's cool or whatever. The same people who buy a Mac or bought Macs back when no one was buying Macs. They want something cool, digital. The problem when you have 15 to 20% uptake of digital identities by the cool people, it's that if you're the government or if you're the private sector, you look at this and you don't say, oh wow, 15% is taken up. You say, why should I develop anything when 85% of the population is not going to use it?
Exactly.
And so in terms of government services, in terms of bank services, in terms of all the other various services that you can use online in my country, you need to make sure that this is a universal digital identity. That means everyone has one. Very important. You don't need to use it. You can continue to use paper all you want. So what if it takes 15 times longer to get done what you want? And if you want to stand in line, no one is stopping you from standing in line in my country. But it's just that if you have a digital identity, you don't have to stand in line. You don't have to fill out papers. So the key thing for having this work, one of the key things, is to make it a universal identity. We were lucky, or some ways. Because we were so unlucky that we were occupied by the Soviet Union, we were lucky when it came to the digital identity, because when we became independent in 1991, if you call the Soviet Union, young people don't even know what it was, but basically you couldn't travel. They wouldn't let you out of the country. People didn't have passports. You had internal passports. If you didn't have passport, you couldn't go abroad. And so the entire country applied for a passport in 1991, 92. And they got them. The problem was in 1999, when we were already thinking ahead, saying, okay, now the entire country is going to want new passports in 2001. So what are we going to do? And first of all, we knew it was going to be a big government expense because we had to get because by the time passports had developed considerably, you had all this biomedical information that was on there. At the same time, in Europe, by 2000, you didn't need to travel between countries with a passport. All you needed was an ID card. And in fact, pretty soon, you didn't actually have to show the ID card, but you always need to have an ID card to travel around in countries other than your own. And so I said, okay, well, we're going to do this expensive passport. Let's also give them a chip card. I mean, a card with a chip that would enable the identification procedure. And so when people came, they ended up getting a chip card. So you basically, as opposed to lots of countries where you have to go through this long process, I said we were lucky because people who applied for a passport got a chip card as well, and then by that way we got far more than the 15 to 25%. And then what we do now, or we've been doing since then, is that as soon as a child is born, you get one. So you have you're caught up with all the people who before didn't have passports or didn't need them. So now everyone has a digital identity which they can use. Again, because I know it's controversial here, no one ever forces you to use your identity card, ever. Just everyone does because it's so much more convenient. Now, the other thing that we did which is also crucial, is the architecture of the system. I won't go into that, but if anyone has an interest in the architecture, if you go on YouTube and you put in X-road, R-O-A-D, and then it'll be parenthesis, long version. That means it's 3.5 minutes, so you don't have to worry about anything too boring. It explains how this system works. But the way to understand it is that all connections are unique and individual. There are no central databases. This gives a huge boost to security, which is that if I want to access something, say my medical records, or my property records, or my bank account, I want to go to the bank, or I want to go to my medical records. I have to be authenticated by the authentication center, which then connects me to my records, no one else's records. And if I want to go to the bank, I go log on the bank page, then I verify myself through the authentication center. It takes me to my bank account, no other bank account. What in terms of cybersecurity this means is that if everyone's got, you got your firewall around you, or you have your ID system that is protecting you from the guys coming in who want to attack, if they get in, they only get into one little cell. Or imagine, in the medieval era, you get into the castle, but then you're in the room. Well, you get into one room. You can't go and take over the castle because you're in that one little room. That helps as a metaphor. So with that system in place, we kicked off a number of services. I'm going to be talking to finance ministers later on. Of course, finance ministers love digitization because it means you get more money. That's understandable. It's a good thing to do. But what you really need to do in order for a digitized society to work is to, once the finance ministers get what they want, because they're your allies. In every government, the finance ministers love digitization. But if you want it to work, you want to work on or provide things people like. So one thing that people really like is having an easy way to pay taxes. So in my country, everybody, 99% of the population does their taxes online. Because, in the digital era, it's so easy. If you're getting paid, well, your employer reports how much they're paying. If you have kids, well, you have kids that they have IDs, you know that they exist, so there you get your deduction for your kids. If you have a mortgage and you're lucky enough to get a mortgage deduction, the bank has informed the tax agency that there's this thing, and you get, and if if you contribute to the Boy Scouts or something, the Boy Scouts will report that you've donated money for the Boy Scouts and how much. And so then, so you log on, and then there's how much you've made. There's how much how much you get, how big the deductions are. And you look at it, and you think, okay, that's right. Then you press a button, and your taxes are done. So it takes 3 to 5 minutes to do your taxes in my country.
Wow.
There's no reason why, I mean, it's, obviously if you have a business, it becomes more complicated, but because you have to account for more things. But if you're a salaried employee, there is no reason why your taxes should take more than 3 to 5 minutes, because the data are all there. I mean, what the system does is it connects all of the data and puts it out for you as you are. So there again, no central database, all of the inputs come together, it's for you, you see it, you say yes or no. Now, so one of the key things, again, I would stress is you want a digitized society, create services for people. I mean, there's all the other stuff on government efficiency. Yeah, that's true, but I mean, but if you want people to come along with you on this, make the services for the people. So, okay, tax is one thing. We have digital prescriptions. Again, kind of a no-brainer. If you go to the doctor, he doesn't give you a piece of, well, he can give you a piece of paper, because you always have the right to have that piece of paper, but no one ever does, because the doctor will simply go and put it into the computer. And then you go to any pharmacy, stick in your card, identify yourself with your code, and you get your medicine. Again, people love it. I mean, 98% of prescriptions are done this way. And we've now taken it a step further, which is that since Finland has adopted our system, the X-Road, and has an identity system, this is like a first, a unique thing. We have a cross-border pharmaceutical system now. Wow. So Finns, we get 8 million Finns visiting us a year. Wow. I mean, that's a lot of Finns. And, I mean, if you're a small country, that's a lot. And they're always having a good time, and in the process, often losing their medicine and other things as well. But anyway, on the medicine thing, so today, I mean, if you lose, well, not today, starting this summer, if you lose your medicine, you call your doctor in Finland, or you write him an email, and then he will do what needs to be done, and you can go to any pharmacy in the country and put in your Finnish ID, and you get your medicine. Wow. That process, however, does illustrate all of the issues that you have to deal with, because I made this proposal to the President of Finland 5 years ago. President of Finland said, great idea, let's do it. I talked to the techies. I said, how long would this take? He said, about a week. I mean, that's what just to make the technical stuff. How long did it take? 6 years. And it's not just government slowness, because when you start thinking about all the stuff that's out there that you have to do, you understand why it takes a lot of time, because in my country, we subsidize some medicines and this much for this group of people. In Finland, they subsidize other medicines for like a different group of people. One heart medicine is subsidized in one place, another. If the idea is that you always pay, or you can't make any money off this cross-country, cross-border thing, you have to pay. If you're a Finn, you come to Estonia, you have to pay what you'd pay in Finland. And if an Estonian goes to Finland, he has to pay what he would pay in Estonia. To get that to work took a long, long time. But none of it's technological. It's all regulation, it's all negotiation, it's all human work. So that in order for this thing to work seamlessly, you really need to do a lot of what I would say is sort of the social software. One of the immediate outgrowths of what we did was an explosion in transparency. All public expenditures are online. So, and this, of course, you say about jobs. I mean, if you're a journalist, this is, you know, what a job. I mean, because all you do is every day looking at who's bought what. And this was kind of a regular feature of when I was president, was that, you know, every day it'd be like, you know, the Chancery bought this rug. Why did it buy this rug? You know, because it's all listed there. Our expenditures are there. So one area that doesn't suffer from this. Of course, the other side of it is that you also know who's looking at your records. So you can say, oh, that newspaper. So, I mean, it works two ways. You don't get to look anonymously. But the real effect of digitization or automatization of bureaucratic processes is in reducing a particular kind of corruption that most affects citizens. There are two, basically you can say there are two kinds of corruption. One kind is when you pay someone, usually high up, a lot of money to do something illegal. You know, like, give me that contract, I'll give you money, where instead of having an honest tender, you pay someone a lot of money and then he directs the contract toward you. The low-level corruption, we distinguish between these in our legal system too, is when you pay someone to, an official to do what he should be doing anyway.
Yes.
Right? So, I mean, you want to get a permit to dig a hole, or you want to, whatever it is that you're supposed to, what you have, you are entitled to do or get, but you need some kind of form to do it, and then you have to pay someone to do it, and this is a form of rent for officials that you don't. I mean, you may not make that much money from your job, but you're making a lot of money by basically taking money from your citizens for doing your job. Now, what you do once you're digitized in this way, well, most of those things don't require any real decisions, because if you tick off all the boxes, okay, you live in this place, you're this age, or you own this property. Say, I want to dig a hole. This is my favorite, because I mean, it's one of those things where, I mean, you want to dig a hole, you need permission to dig a hole, because all kind of bad things could happen if you just dig a hole and suddenly there's a gas main underneath there, an electrical line. So it makes sense. But I don't want to go and fill out a form and go to the then wait and pay someone to get what I should get. I just fill it out online. Okay, the computer looks through it. Okay, you live there, you're this, you're that, and this place has no gas line or electrical line under it. Dig your hole. So you get the permissions digitally. If you multiply that through society, you actually reduce a lot of the friction that makes life difficult in countries, and that also, makes countries corrupt. So my country was, like most other communist countries, fairly corrupt in 1991, 92. Today, we are in the top half of the EU in lack of corruption. So we're number 21 in the recently released Transparency International list, and that is, and there are a lot of old European countries that are behind us. So we are number 11 in the world on rule of law, way ahead. I mean, the United States is 18 on that. So we're, well, maybe that may be due to the president. But no, I mean, and at the same time, we are number one in internet freedom. So, you get these benefits. I can talk more about it when we get to the Q&A.
I was wondering if you could talk about how Estonia maneuvered fiscal constraints and even the critical infrastructure needed at the time when it regained independence. And as you said, Estonia was lacking in resources. How did you sort of deal with those constraints as you thought of the e-Estonia strategy?
Yeah. Okay. Well, it was actually this was a spur. I mean, what for action? In 1993. Finland, the government of Helsinki offered to give us, for free, their telephone exchange, which was from 1979. So it was a lot newer than what we had. except it was an analog system, and the reason why they were giving it for free was they were going over to a digital telephone system. And so, and they were, this is the kind of stuff that I say it's politics or political will. There were a lot of people saying, we can save a lot of money. Let's take their system over. And I said, no, you can't do that because you're going to be locked into legacy technology, which is another one lesson which is always important, is no legacy technology. And that's why always whenever you start, you start off with an advantage because you're still more ahead than other people.
Absolutely.
And then what we decided that if we wanted the digital technology, what we ended up doing was an agreement with a Swedish telecom company to actually digitize the telephone system, and it was a concession agreement. So our requirement was to bring in digital, fixed line digital, not yet, to the entire country, and then they would then run the telecom company for a certain number of years. And of course, when that period is over, we opened it up to competition, which is actually also vital. But anyway, so you need to get that stuff done. Well, the private sector came along very early because they are, of course, generally quicker than governments. And they saw immediately the advantages of having a secure system. And so I said, I mean, they were really, the banks, I have to say, were the biggest drivers. And we had some really sharp people in the banks. Sharper actually than kind of the old country banks, in the sense that we had our banks, there was a big Swedish bank sort of that bought up one of our Estonian banks. And this is kind of typical. I'm sure you run into this in Jamaica. I mean, Edward Said has written an entire book on this called Orientalism, but they sort of, we're going to teach you people now how to do things. And so they came in, they bought this bank, and they said precisely, now we're going to teach you how to do electronic banking. And then our guy said, well, maybe you want to look at what we're doing first. And the Swedes looked at it, they said, you're coming to Stockholm right now. And so the Estonians ended up doing the Swedish banking system's IT because, so I mean, there were funny things like that. But the banking, I mean, we just happened to have a lot of smart guys who saw this. And of course, the other thing that happened, and I should mention one thing that happened as a result of this, and was crucial for our development, and this is a real one-off. We had 4 guys in my country, and they were in their 20s, and they were geeks. And they got together. 2 of them knew each other. The other 2, I mean, they're 2 pairs of friends, and they got together in college, and they invented something called Kazaa, which was a file swapping program. There was also one called Napster. These people were then basically, I mean, after they narrowly avoided going to jail in the US because of inventing this new technology that allowed people to listen to CDs for free. Well, the idea, if you understand a little bit of IT, the idea of sharing files, audio files, leads to a next step, which is, well, you can do it online in real time, which is what they did, and they called it Skype. And so 4 young Estonians invented Skype. Okay, they got rich, but what the effect on society was, I mean, Estonia, it's cold, half of the year is dark, a lot of the year it's raining. It's far away from everything, I mean, from the bright lights of Paris, London, and all these other things. So there's this entire provincialism hang-up, and suddenly these 4 guys invent something that became almost immediately a worldwide brand. And that, in turn, had a huge effect socially or sociologically, that for suddenly it became cool to go and study STEM. Science, technology, engineering, and math. Before, I mean, like everywhere, everyone wants to do, wants to read, Derrida and deconstructionism, and now suddenly you had this huge upsurge, and which continues to this day, where we have more applications for people studying in the technical university, studying computer science, than you do for really anything else. And that, of course, I mean, that becomes a snowball, because then you have more people studying tech, you have more people starting companies involved in tech, and so you get this kind of positive, virtuous circle you have to go. In many countries in Europe, or most, you need to have an ID. I mean, it doesn't have to be digital, but you need an ID. I mean, in Germany, you know, have the Personalausweis, and in Sweden, you have the Personnummer, and I mean, in the US, you have a social, if you work, you get a social security number. The question is the level of what that identity card is. So if you have even a card. I mean, in the US, for years and years, all you had was the social security card was a number, just a piece of paper with a number on it. And you know, in Germany, you know, when I lived there, I had an identity card. I mean, I was a resident, and you have to carry one. You know, just in the U.S. is probably one of the few places where you don't have to have it, or the UK, Canada, you don't have to have one, but most people do, and you know, most people in my country and over the age of 18, or in the United States, over 16, 17, have driver's licenses, and that's your ID, or people have passports. We just wanted, our thinking was that we wanted to have the ID, which you know, people will have an ID anyway, but that to put a chip on it, that was the step. I mean, so that it would be usable in the digital world. Because in the digital world, you're much more vulnerable. I mean, if you live in a non-digital world, it's enough to have a driver's license with your picture on it. You know, people look at the picture and say, you're you. Well, you can't do that in digital space, because it doesn't have to. So it could be someone else who just says they're you. And so you need some way of verifying you are you. And how to, well, so we just said you had to have one. And people, I mean, we did have, I mean, since you constantly have to prove your identity in society anyway. If you go to the bank, you need to prove your identity. And if you're going to, I mean, whatever, you know, if you go to register your child to school, you have to prove your identity. You know, the requirement for identity is pretty universal, so what we decided to do is just wrap it all up into one package. And that even it's in one place. So you don't need to have, you know, birth certificates, marriage certificates. You know, you have, you know, in the United States, again, I just heard a story where, you know, the guy wanted to register his car. He had to go find his marriage certificate so his wife could be co-listed on the car. And then, I mean, he had to go get, and he had been married for 30 years, lucky guy, and he had to go get a marriage certificate from another state from 30 years ago in order to register his car, so that his wife could drive it. I mean, this is, but IDs are part of functioning in modern society anyway. All we did was just wrap it up into a single one-stop picture. I mean,
one-stop shop. Great, great. Thank you so very much, President Ilves.